Welcome to Vidhera English. Today we will learn about 3 English structures that often confuse learners. They are have had, has had, and had had. For example, I have had this phone for 3 years. She has had a difficult day. I had had breakfast before I left home. At first, these structures may look strange, especially had had. But there is a simple reason why these combinations exist. To understand them, we need to understand the 2 jobs that the words are doing. The verb have can be a main verb. For example, I have a car. Here, have is the main verb. Now, when we want to put the main verb have into the present perfect, we use have or has with the past participle. The past participle of have is had. So have plus had becomes have had, and has plus had becomes has had. For example, I have had a car for 5 years. Here, have is the helping verb and had is the past participle of the main verb have. So have had is simply the present perfect form of the verb have. Now let us understand the difference between have had and has had. The choice between have had and has had depends on the subject. We use have had with I, you, we, they, and plural nouns. For example, I have had, you have had, we have had, they have had, and my friends have had. We use has had with he, she, it, and singular nouns. For example, he has had, she has had, it has had, Rahul has had, my sister has had, and the company has had. So I, you, we, they, and plural nouns take have had. He, she, it, and singular nouns take has had. For example, I have had this phone for 3 years. They have had many problems recently. She has had this car for 5 years. My brother has had a busy week. Now let us understand what have had actually means. Have had is not a special expression with one fixed meaning. It is simply the present perfect form of have. The meaning of have depends on what the sentence is talking about. Have can mean possess something, experience something, eat or drink something, go through a situation, receive or encounter something, or be in a particular state or condition. When we put that verb into the present perfect, we get have had or has had. So the real question is why we are using the present perfect form of have. We use it when the situation involving have is being viewed in relation to the present. Now let us see how this works in different situations. The verb have can mean possession. In the present, we can say I have this phone. In the present perfect, we can say I have had this phone for 3 years. Why do we use have had? Because the possession began in the past and is being described as a situation that is connected to the present. The meaning is that I got the phone in the past and I still have it now. Another example is she has had this car for 5 years. The possession began in the past, and the situation continues to the present. So here, have had or has had is the present perfect form of the verb have meaning possession. For example, I have had this laptop for 2 years. My parents have had this house since 2010. We have had this sofa for many years. He has had the same watch since college. The verb have can also mean to experience something. For example, I have many interesting experiences. When we talk about experiences that have occurred during the period up to now, we can use the present perfect. We can say I have had many interesting experiences. Why? Because we are looking at the experiences accumulated up to the present. For example, I have had some wonderful experiences while traveling. This does not mean that the experiences are still happening. The individual experiences are finished. The point is that they are part of the person's experience up to now. For example, I have had some amazing experiences in my life. She has had many interesting experiences while traveling. We have had some unforgettable experiences together. He has had many different experiences in his career. We can also use have had to talk about situations or periods that someone has experienced. For example, I have had a difficult week. She has had a busy day. We have had a difficult year. They have had a lot of problems recently. Why do we use the present perfect here? Because the speaker is looking at the situation from the present. For example, I have had a difficult week. The speaker is evaluating the week from the present point of view. The situation belongs to the period leading up to now, so the present perfect is appropriate. For example, we have had a busy morning. He has had a stressful month. I have had a very tiring day. They have had a difficult few weeks. The verb have is also commonly used for meals and drinks. For example, I have lunch at 1 o'clock. Now suppose lunch has already happened and the speaker is talking about the present situation. We can say I have had lunch. Why? because the meal is completed, but the fact that the speaker has eaten is relevant now. For example, someone may ask, "Would you like some lunch?" And we can answer, "No thanks. I have had lunch." The eating happened in the past, but its result is relevant to the present. I do not need lunch now because I have already eaten. So have had does not mean that the action is still continuing. For example, I have had breakfast already. She has had 2 cups of tea today. We have had dinner, so we do not need anything to eat. He has already had some coffee. We can also use have had when someone has experienced a problem or difficulty. For example, I have had some problems recently. She has had trouble with her car. We have had a few difficulties this week. Why do we use the present perfect? Because the speaker is talking about problems experienced during a period that is connected to the present. The important idea is not that the word problem requires have had. The important idea is the time relationship. Compare I had a problem yesterday. This refers to a specific finished past time. But I have had a few problems recently describes experiences during a period leading up to the present. For example, I have had some trouble with my phone recently. They have had a few problems with the new system. She has had some difficulty finding a new job. We have had some problems with the internet lately. Present perfect does not mean that the action must still be happening. For example, I have had lunch. Lunch is finished. I have had 3 cups of coffee today. The cups of coffee have already been drunk. I have had a great time. The enjoyable experience has happened. In all these sentences, the event may be complete. The reason for using the present perfect is that the speaker is connecting that past event or experience to the present. So, I have had my shower. We have had a good conversation. She has had her breakfast already. I have had enough to eat. We can also use have had when something has happened during a period that is still connected to now. For example, I have had 3 meetings today. We have had several visitors this week. She has had a lot of work this month. The meetings, visits, or work may already have happened. But the time period such as today, this week, or this month is still connected to the present. That is why the present perfect can be used. Compare I had 3 meetings yesterday with I have had 3 meetings today. The difference comes from the relationship between the past event and the time period being discussed. For example, I have had 4 classes today. She has had several calls this morning. We have had a lot of work this week. They have had many visitors this month. Now let us compare have had and had. Compare I had this phone for 3 years with I have had this phone for 3 years. The first sentence presents the possession as a past situation. The second connects that possession to the present. Another example is I had a difficult week last week and I have had a difficult week. The first refers to a completed past week. The second describes the current experience of the period leading up to now. So the important difference is not the word week. It is the time perspective. For example, I have had this bag for 3 years. I had this bag when I was in college. She has had this job for 5 years. She had this job before she moved to another city. When we mention a finished past time, the simple past is normally used. For example, I had lunch at 1 p.m. She had a headache yesterday. We had a meeting last Monday. But when the past event is connected to the present and no finished past time is being specified, the present perfect can be used. For example, I have had lunch. She has had a headache all morning. We have had several meetings this week. The tense depends on the relationship between the event and the time of speaking. For example, I have had coffee today. I had coffee yesterday morning. We have had 2 meetings today. We had 2 meetings yesterday. Now we come to the structure that looks the strangest, had. But the logic is actually very simple. The verb have has the past participle had. To make the past perfect, we use had with the past participle. So for the verb have, had plus had becomes had. The first had is the helping verb. The second had is the past participle of have. Therefore, had is simply the past perfect form of the verb have. We use the past perfect when we want to talk about a situation involving have that occurred before a particular point or event in the past. For example, I had had breakfast before I left home. There are 2 past points. First, I had breakfast. Later, I left home. The breakfast happened before the leaving. So the earlier situation can be expressed with the past perfect. I had had breakfast before I left home. The first had is the past perfect helping verb, and the second had is the past participle of have. For example, she had had lunch before the meeting started. They had had dinner before we arrived. He had had enough time to prepare before the interview began. We had had a discussion before we made the decision. The verb have can mean possession, so its past perfect form can also describe possession before another past point. For example, I had had the car for 5 years before I sold it. The sequence is that I possessed the car and then I sold the car. The possession existed before the later past event. Another example is she had had the phone for 2 years before she lost it. Here, had means that she possessed the phone before the later event. For example, we had had that house for 10 years before we moved. He had had his laptop for only a few months before it stopped working. I had had the car for 6 years before I decided to sell it. They had had the apartment for several years before they moved abroad. The same structure can describe experiences that happened before another past point. For example, she had had several difficult experiences before she moved abroad. The experiences happened earlier. Moving abroad happened later, so had places those experiences before the later past event. Another example is they had had many successful projects before the company expanded. For example, I had had several good experiences before I started working there. She had had many challenges before she became successful. He had had several interesting experiences before he became a teacher. We had had some difficult experiences before things finally improved. We can also use had with meals. For example, I had had breakfast before I went to work. She had had lunch before the meeting started. They had had dinner before we arrived. In each sentence, the meal happened before another past event. Again, had is not being used because the sentence contains the word breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It is being used because the speaker is placing that event before another past reference point. For example, we had had breakfast before the guests arrived. He had had dinner before he went to bed. I had had lunch before I left the office. They had had coffee before the interview began. We can also use had with problems and situations. For example, we had had several problems before we found the cause. He had had a difficult time before things improved. She had had enough before she finally left. The important relationship is earlier situation followed by a later past event. That is what the past perfect expresses. For example, I had had several problems before I found a solution. They had had a difficult time before things finally improved. She had had many difficulties before she found the right opportunity. He had had some trouble with his car before he took it to the mechanic. Now let us make the central comparison between have had and had had. With have had or has had, the reference point is the present. For example, I have had this car for 5 years. The possession began in the past and is being viewed from now. With had, the reference point is in the past. For example, I had had this car for 5 years before I sold it. The possession existed before another past event. So have had and has had describe a past situation connected to now. Had describes an earlier situation connected to a past reference point. For example, I have had this phone for 3 years. I had had this phone for 3 years before I bought a new one. She has had this job for 5 years. She had had this job for 5 years before she resigned. Now compare these examples. I have had this job for 5 years. The speaker is looking at the situation now. I had had the job for 5 years before I resigned. The speaker is looking back at the situation from another point in the past. Another pair is she has had the car for 3 years and she had had the car for 3 years before she sold it. The first sentence connects the possession to the present. The second places the possession before a later past event. For example, I have had this watch for 10 years. I had had this watch for 10 years before I lost it. We have had this house since 2015. We had had the house for 8 years before we moved. Now let us ask an important question. Is had always necessary when there are 2 past events? No. Consider the sentence I had lunch before I left. This is completely natural. We can also say I had had lunch before I left. Both are grammatically possible. When words such as before, after, when, or the context already make the sequence obvious, simple past is very common in everyday speech. For example, I had lunch before I left. The word before already tells us which event happened first. Past perfect can be used when the earlier past relationship is important to the sentence. For example, by the time I arrived, they had had dinner. He had had the car for 10 years before he sold it. So the purpose of had is not to make a sentence more complicated. It is to place a situation involving have before a past reference point when that relationship is relevant. For example, I had breakfast before I went to work. I had had breakfast before I went to work. She left after she had lunch. She left after she had had lunch. Both can be possible depending on the context and the emphasis. Now let us look at questions with have had and has had. The helping verb comes before the subject. Have you had lunch? Have you had enough time? Have they had any problems? Has she had a chance to call you? Has he had any experience with this? Has the company had any difficulties? The structure is have or has, followed by the subject, followed by had. For example, have you had breakfast? Have they had enough time to finish? Has she had any trouble with the new system? Has he had a chance to speak to you? Now let us look at questions with had. For the past perfect, we use had, followed by the subject, followed by had. For example, had you had breakfast before you left? Had she had enough time to prepare? Had they had any problems before the meeting? Had he had the car for long before he sold it? More examples are had you had lunch before the meeting started? Had she had any experience before she joined the company? Had they had enough time to prepare before the guests arrived? Had he had the phone for long before he lost it? Now let us look at negative forms. For have had, we can say I have not had lunch yet. We have not had any problems. They have not had enough time. For has had, we can say she has not had a chance to call. He has not had any experience with this. For had, we can say I had not had breakfast before I left. She had not had enough time to prepare. They had not had any experience before that. The structures are have not plus had, has not plus had, and had not plus had. More examples are I have not had any coffee today. We have not had a chance to talk yet. She has not had any problems recently. He had not had breakfast before he left. They had not had enough time before the meeting started. There is another very common structure, have had to. Here, have to expresses necessity. When we put it into the present perfect, we use have or has, followed by had to and the base verb. For example, I have had to work late this week. She has had to change her plans. We have had to wait for an hour. They have had to cancel the meeting. The present perfect tells us that these necessities have occurred during a period connected with the present. Compare I have to work late today. This describes a current necessity. I have had to work late several times this week. This describes necessities that have occurred during the period up to now. For example, I have had to wake up early this week. We have had to change our plans. She has had to work from home recently. They have had to make several changes this month. The same idea can be moved into the past perfect. We use had to followed by the base verb. For example, I had had to work late for several weeks before I finally took a break. She had had to change her plans before we spoke to her. They had had to wait for hours before the bus arrived. Here, the necessity existed before another past event. For example, I had had to work late before I finally went home. He had had to wait for 2 hours before the doctor arrived. We had had to change our plans before the weather improved. She had had to cancel the trip before we spoke to her. Finally, let us look at some very common everyday expressions containing have had. The first expression is I have had enough. This means that you no longer want to tolerate or continue something. For example, I have had enough. I am leaving. I have had enough of these arguments. More examples are I have had enough of this noise. I have had enough. I do not want to discuss this anymore. The next expression is I have had it. This means that you can no longer tolerate a situation. For example, I have had it with these excuses. I have had it. I am done. This is generally stronger and more emotional than I have had enough. More examples are I have had it with this computer. I have had it. I cannot deal with this anymore. Another common expression is I have not had a chance to. This means that you have not yet had an opportunity or enough time to do something. For example, I have not had a chance to call her yet. I have not had a chance to read the report. Have you had a chance to talk to him? This expression is extremely common in everyday and professional conversation. More examples are I have not had a chance to check my email yet. I have not had a chance to speak to him. Have you had a chance to look at the document? She has not had a chance to reply yet. The last expression is I have had trouble. This means that you have experienced difficulty with something. For example, I have had trouble sleeping lately. I have had trouble understanding this. We have had trouble with the internet. Again, the expression uses the present perfect because the speaker is describing a difficulty experienced during a period connected with the present. More examples are I have had trouble using this app. She has had trouble finding a new apartment. We have had trouble with the internet this week. He has had trouble understanding the instructions. Thank you for watching. If you found this lesson helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to Vidhera English for more such content.